only make a set number of eggs. What else do we remember about female repro?
The ova carries a lot more than the sperm. The way that my cell bio teacher said that it's got the whole bus, you know, and everything but the kitchen sink is in the ova.
Yep, all of the organelles that are necessary for making that whole new individual are contained in the ova. The sperm contributes DNA. That's it.
Yep, that's why I said.
We are all more than 50% of our mother than we are of our father.
There's that video, you gotta play that song.
I'm going to.
I love it.
I know.
And I played it for my son.
So
It's
sweet.
very catchy.
It is so sweet.
Uterus?
We have a uterus. Yes, we have a uterus.
That's a reproductive organ.
It's an important reproductive organ that males don't carry. Yeah. So, of course, we need both genders, sexes, right? We need both to contribute to the reproductive and the reproduction and the carrying on of the species. This is very true. But the female has a special role to play. So, as this says, like the male system, the female system is responsible for producing hormones and gametes. And the hormones, of course, are predominantly estrogen and progesterone. And then there is the production of the ova. Whereas in males, it's testosterone and sperm, right? Those are the comparing systems. And the secretions for both are going to be moving things around. Just like peristalsis is involved in both systems to move things around. As this says, we females are responsible for housing the developing embryo and fetus, delivering that fetus, and then supporting that fetus after birth through nourishment. And so we have a little bit more complex system than males do in that regard. We have ovaries. We have uterine tubes. You might hear them referred to as fallopian tubes or oviducts. All those terms are applicable. We have a uterus. The uterus is a smooth muscle structure which houses the developing embryo and fetus. There's a vagina, which is a reciprocal structure for intercourse to receive the sperm. There are some external genitalia and the mammary glands that are all involved in female reproduction. The mammary glands sort of, not, I won't say extraneous, but they are sort of extra to the process. They're there to nourish the newly born fetus. We're going to talk about oogenesis, making ova. We're going to talk about folliculogenesis, which is the structures that house the developing oocytes. We're going to talk about the ovarian cycle and link it to the uterine cycle because they are meshed. Sometimes they get out of whack, but we're going to mash all that up and see how all of that ties together. We'll talk a bit about female sexual response, just in the same vein as we did about male sexual response, and a little bit about milk production, so we can support our lab work when we look at the mammary glands. And you remember that in the absence of this, right, sex-determining region of the Y chromosome, thank you, we are the default, right? If that sex-determining region in the Y chromosome doesn't get turned on, then all of those structures in the embryo that have not been determined are going to turn into female structures. So instead of testes, we develop ovaries. And we remember that it is this Mullerian inhibiting factor that is going to be responsible for why we get oviducts rather than vas deferens, why we get ovaries rather than testes. Where did this Mullerian inhibiting factor come from? Does anybody remember that? The sustentacular cells, exactly right. Yep. And so without that Mullerian inhibiting factor and testosterone, then we're going to get oviducts, we're going to get a vagina, we're going to get ovaries, and everything that is pertaining to a female's reproductive structures. And so keep in mind then that there are certain structures like the clitoral glands that is synonymous with the prepuce. The glans penis of the penis. We have, instead of these urogenital folds, which ultimately become the rhaphe of the scrotal sac, then we have the development of the two labia, the labia minora and the labia majora, which we'll discuss in a little further detail when we get to it. So we have external genitalia and internal genitalia, just like in males. Our external genitalia includes the clitoris, which is this little structure right here. And actually, the clitoris is, the glands of the clitoris is exposed, but the clitoris itself is really looks just like the penis, doesn't it?
Mm.
It's just a whole bit smaller, but it also has the two roots, just like the penis had the two roots. The clitoris has the same two roots. We have the labia majora and the labia minora. You may refer to them as labia minus or labia majus, majus, I think it's majus. There are a couple of different terms. They're all acceptable for those two structures. Inside we have the ovaries, and the oviduct and the uterus and the vagina, the uterine tubes, of course, are important. Oviducts are uterine tubes. The vagina, of course, is an internal structure as well. So that's what we're going to spend our time talking about. The ovaries, first thing for us to consider, are paired, two, one on either side, kind of lumpy. They're about the size, have you seen a walnut? The shape and size of a walnut. So they're about the shape and size of a walnut. And they get lumpier as they get older because as they produce that ova every month from puberty on to about, 45, 55, depending on the woman, they get more scarred because every time an ova is ovulated off of the surface of the ovary, you get a structure called a corpus luteum. And then that corpus luteum becomes a corpus albicans, which is just a scar. So we have a limited number of ova to begin with, and we pop them off on a monthly basis, usually, and that leaves back those pits, those scarry pits called corpus albicans. The ovary has a medulla, just like almost all these glandular structures, and a cortex. And surrounding the outside is a peritoneum, the visceral peritoneum, or you can call it the capsule around the ovary, and these are cuboidal cells, interestingly enough. What else? The ovaries are responsible for producing estrogen and progesterone, and they respond to follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Where do they come from? Yeah, here, pituitary? Yeah, pituitary, for sure. Yeah. And where do they respond from? What do they respond to? You remember you got the grand poobah, the boss, the hypothalamus, right? And the gonadotropin hormone is stimulating the pituitary to produce follicle stimulating luteinizing hormone. Yeah. We got so here is this so interesting. This outer periphery of the cortex is layered with many, many, many primordial follicles that contain primary oocytes. And as the time goes on, each month, some of these primordial follicles develop into primary follicles. And the primary follicles develop into secondary follicles. But only one of those secondary follicles is going to be the one that ovulates to eventually become known as a Graafian follicle or a tertiary follicle or vesicular follicle that this little secondary oocyte pops off of. We'll talk more about that as we go along. But it is fascinating to see the sequence of events along the length of the ovary right here. The ovary is suspended in a connective tissue structure called the broad ligament. So we've got our uterus sitting in the pelvis region. On either side, an ovary that is tucked underneath and surrounded by the oviduct and held in place by this ligament called the broad ligament. And the broad ligament is further divided into what's called the mesometrium below the ovary. We have a mesosalpinx above the ovary and connected to the oviduct. And then the ovary itself is held to the mesosalpinx by one called the mesoovarium, just to give the ovary a little bit of structural support, because it's not connected to the oviduct. The oviduct is actually wrapped around it by these things called fimbria, and the fimbria sort of wrap around the ovary itself. The ovary has one ovarian ligament here, tying it to the uterine wall. But other than that, it's just sort of floating out there, along with that little connector, that mesoovarium. So the three of them form this big, broad ligament that literally holds all of these structures in some semblance where they're sort of hanging in the pelvic cavity, just sort of hanging there. We have some other ligaments that are holding things in place. The round ligament here is tying this structure to the, look at that, the uterine, the floor essentially of the pelvis, and connected to the labia majora. We have the suspensory ligament. Where's our suspensory ligament? Right here. The suspensory ligament is carrying the blood supply for this ovary and the ovarian structures. We have a uterosacral ligament that's tying the uterus to the floor of the pelvic cavity as well. Cardinal ligament to the walls, holding this uterine structure in place so that it's not floating around too badly. So females, just like males, enter into puberty, as we talked about. Males enter into puberty sort of around the age of 12, 13, right? And that's all based on that hypothalamic development. We all know, science has told us, that males typically mature a little bit later. And this has something to do with that evolutionary aspect. Why do females mature a little earlier? Why do males mature a little later? So that there's a connection between the reproductive structures, that they can make babies at the right time. Females enter into puberty, as you see here, somewhere in the 8 to 10 range. It's kind of dropped in age. When I was a kid, it was 11, 12, 13, where we would start to menstruate. But now it's 10 where they start to menstruate. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? What's that all about? Yeah. So the fact that we enter into puberty is the result of the hypothalamus delivering those gonadotropin hormones. So, follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone being stimulated by the gonadotropin hormones, gonadotropin-releasing hormones. And the pituitary responds via this follicle-stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. And the follicle-stimulating hormone is the one responsible for taking and developing the follicles, those little pockets that house the primary or secondary oocytes. And we'll see how that all works out in just a moment. The follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates the development of these follicles, and then the follicles produce progesterone and estrogen, which are very important for the ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle, and the matching of those two cycles. Estrogens we love because they help with growth, of course, during puberty, and then they also are important for supporting the lining of the uterus so that the lining of the uterus can support the developing embryo and the fetus as they grow. So the estrogen in puberty, as you can see here, has a lot to do with all of those secondary sex characteristics that show up. For males, broader shoulders, from testosterone, for females, estrogen, and a broader pelvis. Remember looking at the pelvis in 231 and seeing the difference between the female pelvis and the male pelvis? And so the development of that wider pelvis and that bigger birth, pelvic inlet and outlet are the result of estrogen. Fat deposition, which is especially important because fat deposition is going to support those structures, right? All of these things are going to be supported by adipose tissue. And leptin, contained in adipose cells, responsible for appetite, right? Suppression. Breast development, of course, our breasts aren't just glandular tissue. There's a significant amount of adipose tissue in mammary gland and breasts and surrounding mammary glands. And so puberty is an important time, of course, because that's where we get these development of structural secondary sex characteristics.
Real quick.
Yeah.
Folliculogenesis.
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 Uh-huh.
So that is the ripening of the follicle?
It is the development of the follicle
It's the development of.
and the ripening.
I don't know how
think
to,
of
it's like when it. I've
it's a
heard it
maturation
called that,
process
like
of
I'm
the.
saying.
So the follicle supports the development of the oocyte,
Right.
and so that we want to support the oocyte so that it can go from primary to secondary and then be ovulated.
Is it like the chicken sitting on the egg kind of?
So follicular.
Let's just wait till we get there.
Yeah,
It's more like a horse race than it is
okay.
a chicken sitting on an egg.
Okay, so you would define folliculogenesis as the.
Development supporting the development of the follicle, supporting the oocyte. Hang on, okay? It'll become clearer.
Okay.
It will become clearer. So we, in the development of puberty, we go through this first phase called thelarchy. And thelarchy is the development of the mammary tissue and the breasts. Remember when you were a little girl, and I'm speaking to all the exes here. When you were a little girl, you developed these little buds, little nipples, little prepubescent breasts. This is referred to as thelarchy, the development of your breast tissue. And you can think estrogen for the deposition of fat, and you can think progesterone for the development of the mammary glands, and the areola, which is that brownish tissue that surrounds the nipple itself. So we are dependent early on in puberty for the development of mammary glands and breasts. We have then into pubarchy where we develop our pubic and axillary hair, same as males. Remember, there's no sexual dimorphism for axillary and pubic hair. We start to produce some apocrine gland activity. Do you remember the difference between, right? Do you remember the difference between an apocrine gland and a merocrine gland?
Types of stuff secreted, like oils versus water.
It's how it's secreted.
And it's like, oh yeah, it's
It's
the
how it's secreted.
tops comes off or things go
Yeah.
on.
Either you're just secreting the stuff or you're blowing up the cell completely. In this case, you're secreting some of the stuff because the cell has kind of fallen apart, but you're not blowing the whole cell up. So apocrine secretion versus the apocrine glands, there's a difference there. Yeah. And so, of course, we all know that we produce some androgens at the same time as we're producing estrogens. Those androgens are going to be coming, as you might remember, from the adrenal glands. Okay. Yeah. And then we go into menarche. So thelarchy, making our breasts, pubarchy, getting our sexually synonymous hairs and get our gland activity going, and then menarche is the beginning of menstruation, beginning of producing menstrual fluid every month, ovulating an ova every month. This is menarche. Maybe age 12, maybe 13, somewhere in that range. You might actually start your menstrual cycle, but you may not be ovulating for the first year, which is kind of interesting. Interestingly enough, remember I was talking about adipose tissue and how important adipose tissue is in this whole development process? That's because, as you can see here, you have to have a certain amount of it to menstruate. So, have you ever noticed female athletes, how thin they are and how they have no breasts? Guess what? They're not menstruating. They don't menstruate until they quit that excessive athletic endeavor and they start gaining some weight and gaining adipose tissue. Yeah.
Is that why people with, females with anorexia, they lose their menstrual cycle because they're not getting enough fat?
Amenorrhea. Yeah, because there's no adipose tissue. Those leptin. Not only do we need leptin for appetite suppression, but we also need it to suppress gonadotropin release. So if you don't have the adipose tissue, they don't have the leptin. You're not going to suppress the adipose tissue, right? You're not going to suppress the gonadotropins. Interestingly, isn't it? So we're not going to talk about menopause after we get through all of this discussion because there's no sense. Yeah.
What is amenorrhea?
Amenorrhea, no menstruation.
Oh.
Amenstruation.
Oh, did you already say that? Sorry.
Yeah, that's right. All right, so this is so interesting to me. Egg production, oogenesis. So the term oocyte is referring to these immature structures. The term ovum is the mature gamete, and that ovum happens, it's a very brief period of time that we actually refer to as an ovum, because the ovum is when the sperm has penetrated the secondary oocyte, and now we have two little clusters of DNA material. Now we have an ovum. When those two little clusters of DNA material combine, called amphimixis, now we have a structure called a zygote. We have a single-celled structure called a zygote. So an ovum is a very short period of time in between secondary oocyte and zygote. We have this very interesting production of 1 egg per month, typically. Could be 2 eggs per month, it might be no eggs per month. It sort of depends on that individual. You can see here that during embryonic development, the ovaries have stem cells called oogonia plastered all over the place in the ovaries. This is in not embryonic development. Yeah, 5th or 6th week embryonic development. That's prior to fetal development. This is like 6 weeks into mitotic division. The ovaries are developing, and on those ovaries are all these stem cells. And these stem cells undergo mitosis to produce primary oocytes. Remember for producing sperm we had spermatogonium? The spermatogonium mitotically divide, they produce a new spermatogonium and then a primary spermatocyte. Remember all that?
Yeah.
Well, in this case, we're producing primary oocytes from these oogonia. These are the stem cells. And so the oogonia going mitotically dividing, producing millions of oogonia. And these all are going to be, by the time you are born, these oogonia are going to be turned into primary oocytes.
So I was making what would eventually be my son while I was in my mom.
Yes.
Which is pretty
Yes.
crazy.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy? What a way to think of it.
Yeah.
I know. Yeah. So we have all these oogonia crazily dividing while you are developing in the womb of your mother, in your mother's uterus. 5 to 6 weeks, embryonic development. The female germ cells are migrating, they're going, and then they set up house and they start dividing and producing more oogonia. And ultimately, by the time you reach puberty, these oogonia have produced primary oocytes, and then most of them have attreased. They've been resorbed. And so you're left with 2 million or so primary oocytes at birth, and by the time you reach puberty, maybe 200,000 or so left. So we start out getting all these oogonia going, embryonic development, you get all your oogonia divided up, and then they start producing primary oocytes during fetal development, during childhood. These primary oocytes are being produced and then resorbed. So you got 6 or 7 million oogonia that lead to ultimately at puberty 200,000 or so oocytes. And primary oocytes are going to sit there on those ovaries for the length of that woman's life, that female's life. Some of them get used, some of them don't. The cycle that is going to be responsible for delivering these oocytes on a monthly basis called the ovarian cycle, and it's linked to the menstrual cycle. And of course, it's all controlled by hormones. What hormones do you think we're talking about here?
Estrogen, progesterone.
But before that,
FSH and LH.
FSH and LH. We got to have the follicle stimulating hormone to produce the follicles to support the primary oocytes. And then LH is released once a month, and that results in ovulation. And then that secondary oocyte that's ovulated is available for fertilization for 24 hours. That's it. Once it's gone down the tube, it's gone. It's not available anymore. 24 hours. Interestingly enough, unlike males, where we take one spermatogonium, we make a primary spermatocyte, that makes 2 secondary spermatocytes, they make 2 spermatids, so from every primary spermatocyte you end up with 4 spermatids. For females, we have to limit the amount of oocytes that are available. We can't have necessarily 2 oocytes going through this process every time, having twins every time. That'd be crazy. I mean, it might happen, but it doesn't typically. So what happens, and also we have to reduce the number of chromosomes so that when that sperm gets to the ova, we have just the right number of chromosomes recombined to make that new individual. So how many chromosomes do all of your somatic cells contain? 46, right. How many chromosomes do the sperm contain?
23.
Right, and the same is for the ova. So we can't have 2 oocytes, we have to have just 1, because we got to get rid of that extra chromosomal material. Okay, so what happens is that, let's go through here, look at it here. We have our oogonium, the oogonium makes these primary oocytes. These primary oocytes are then arrested in meiosis 1. They're just static in meiosis 1. And they may start out in what we call these primordial follicles, housing our little primary oocytes. And as the young woman reaches puberty, then the gonadotropin-releasing hormones stimulate the release of follicle-stimulating hormone, and follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates the development of follicles. So we would go from these, what they call them egg nests, to a primary follicle. We might have a cluster of primary follicles that are developing. And on our primary follicles, we have these cells called follicular cells, which ultimately are actually stratified cuboidal epithelium. And maybe way back in 231, you remember talking about tissues way back then. And we said, we have stratified cuboidal epithelial arrangement. We just don't talk about it here because we're going to talk about it there. Now we're talking about it.
Okay.
Stratified cuboidal epithelium. It does exist. And that stratified cuboidal epithelium is the follicle that's supporting this little oocyte. The little oocyte is going to be surrounded by this continually developing follicle until, and this one, by the way, is being showered with attention, so to speak. More follicle stimulating hormone delivered here than perhaps other follicles. And so it's like a little horse race as to which follicle is going to actually reach maturity. And once that follicle reaches maturity, it will have this oocyte, this primary oocyte, contained in a fluid-filled pocket. So this is like a little pond of fluid. It's called an atrium. An antrum, sorry, not atrium, antrum. And the oocyte is surrounded by some follicular cells, and it's held in place by a little bridge of follicular cells. And ultimately, there's a hormone called luteinizing hormone that's released mid-cycle, and that luteinizing hormone is going to stimulate this particularly well-matured follicle to ovulate. And this oocyte pops off. And then it is picked up, literally lured into the oviduct by those fingers, those finger-like structures called the fimbria. So the ovary is sitting here, the fimbria are here, pops the oocyte off, and then it's pulled up into the oviduct. And it travels down the oviduct on its way to the uterus. And sperm, if they're present, are going the other way, heading toward that oocyte. And if the sperm get to the oocyte and it's in the oviduct, and it can get through the corona radiata and the zona pellucida, boom, it's in. And you have the developing zygote, maybe. 50% of them don't make it. So there's a lot at stake here. All right, so here's the other thing I want to talk about. So we have this 46 chromosome structure, the oogonium. It produces a primary oocyte, which also has 46 chromosomes. It's diploid. It continues to remain a diploid cell here. this oocyte in the primary follicle is diploid. Here, this primary oocyte is still diploid. But this, right before ovulation, this primary oocyte completes meiosis 1 and enters into meiosis 2. And it is arrested at metaphase 2. What's metaphase 2?
When they meet at the
They're lined up along metaphase plate, right? If they've gone through metaphase 1, that means that the duplicated chromosomes were separated, right? And so in sperm, we made 2 secondary spermatocytes, each of them with 1 set of chromosomes, 23 duplicated chromosomes. They're still sisters. They're in that secondary spermatocyte. In this case, we have 1 secondary oocyte that has the duplicated chromosomes in it, 23 of them. And then we have another part of that division called a polar body. And this polar body contains the other half of those chromosomes. And the whole idea is that we want to get rid of those extra chromosomes so that we only have 23 chromosomes when we put the sperm and the oocyte together. Everybody following? We'll talk about it again when we get to lab. Then we have ovulation. So this right here happens right before ovulation. Ovulation occurs, and if the sperm are available and they can make it all the way to that oocyte and the oviduct, then 1 sperm might make it in and fertilize this oocyte, and then this secondary oocyte completes meiosis 2. But it won't unless it's fertilized. Crazy, huh? While it's completing meiosis 2, of course, those sisters have to be separated. Now we have the sisters, the chromatids, sister chromatids are linked. Now we're going to separate them. That is anaphase of meiosis 2. And we produce another polar body to take away those extra sisters, right? The extra halves. Yeah, so now we have 1 ovum, and we've got 2 little nuclei, DNA material, that they're going to merge and become known as a zygote. So the secondary oocyte is arrested in meiosis 2, ovulation, pushes that secondary oocyte out, makes it available for fertilization. If it's fertilized, it completes meiosis 2. If not, it just goes down and flushed out with the menstrual cycle.
So the polar bodies, they just degenerate, they don't need to be flushed out?
That's right, they just
Okay.
degenerate. Mhm. Yep, and the whole purpose for those polar bodies is to get rid of those extra chromosomes. Polar body 1 to get rid of that extra set of sisters, and polar body 2 to get rid of the half from the sisters. Got it? Think about it. It'll make more and more sense as we go along. Did you have a question?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. All right, so folliculogenesis, this thing that happens in the ovaries, is fascinating. Where is it going to happen? It's going to happen all along the outer edge of the ovary. All along the outer edge of this ovary are what we call egg nests of primordial follicles. And the primordial follicles are made of squamous cells. So they're a little cup, you can just imagine, right? You have the 3-dimensional oocyte, and you have a little cup holding it in place. Just cuddling it, fostering it, harboring it, taking good care of it.
That's the chicken on the egg.
That's the chicken. That's the egg. Okay. All right. These primordial follicles, vast majority of all the follicles on the ovary, all of this out here are primordial follicles. Some of them, each month, are going to develop into what we call primary follicles. Here's our oocyte, that's the nucleus, the cytoplasm, and then we have a ring of cells. Now we're going to call them cuboidal granular granulosa cells. They're full of follicle cells, but they're now got a new name, granulosa cells. And this single layer of cuboidal epithelial cells is going to continue to develop. We can see some of them here. Some of them here. These primary follicles tucked in between and amongst the primordials. As these follicles continue to develop, and by the way, they are starting to produce estrogen and progesterone, but it is follicle stimulating hormone that's supporting their growth, right? So follicle stimulating hormone coming from the pituitary, supporting the growth of the follicles. And the follicles are supporting this oocyte. There's the nucleus, this is the cytoplasm, and this oocyte is starting to get a little protein structure called the zona pellucida surrounding it. The zona pellucida is taken care of and going to carry on with that oocyte when it gets ovulated, if it gets ovulated. These stratified cuboidal epithelial cells continue to stratify, and you get what's known as a primary follicle, but starts to develop into something called a secondary follicle. When we see a space developing, and this space fills with fluid, we have what's known as a secondary follicle. But it houses a primary oocyte. I know. This primary oocyte is surrounded by that protein structure called the zona pellucida. And also we see now something that's known as the corona radiata, which is a continuation of these granulosa cells, just specifically around this primary oocyte. We have surrounding this developing follicle cells called thecal cells. And the way I think of the thecal cells is the thecal cells are taking care of the follicular cells, and the follicular cells are taking care of the oocyte. The follicular cells are releasing estrogen and progesterone. And that estrogen and progesterone is all about preparing the uterus, getting the uterus ready to house a developing embryo. Yeah.
What is the purpose of the stratified cuboidal MS spot? Like, what is it?
They're making the estrogen and progesterone.
Okay.
Yeah, they're the follicle cells, the follicular cells.
Okay.
Thecal cells, we don't see them really well in this image, but the thecal cells are just outside of the follicle. They look kind of linear in their arrangement. Then we have luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone, of course, is going to be result of the pituitary gland. It is delivered once a month, mid-cycle, and it's responsible for ovulation. As you can see here, the luteinizing hormone insulin also keep these thecal cells in check and keep giving them some cholesterol so they can support themselves, right? Cholesterol, good source of energy. And there is apparently some androgens that are produced that get converted to estrogens. So this is a good example. This is a good image. So we have our primary oocyte. That's the nucleus. We have the zona pellucida, that protein layer. The corona radiata, it's like a bridge holding this primary oocyte to the granulosa cells of the follicle. And these are the thecal cells. See the linear aspect? Those are thecal cells supporting the follicle supporting this primary oocyte. This big space here is called the antrum, and it's fluid filled. This is close to being considered a mature follicle. You can also call it a Graafian follicle, that's like the name I learned. You could call it a vesicular follicle, you could call it a tertiary follicle, or an antral follicle. All of those terms are acceptable for this particular structure.
Tertiary and mature follicles are the same thing?
Mature follicle, yep.
Is the same as the tertiary? It
Yep.
seems kind of differentiated in the book, that's why I was.
Mature, tertiary, vesicular, antral, or Graafian.
Okay.
Yep, yep. Yeah, I know. We're gonna consider them all.
You sure? Yeah.
Yep. This antrum gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it's so full of fluid, and then that luteinizing hormone comes along and pops that ovary right off. The fluid pushes it right out. Fimbria pick it up, deliver it to the oviduct. Blood oocyte barrier. Why would we need to have a blood oocyte barrier? This is a mature follicle.
So the immune system will attack the different antigens that it carries.
Same with the sperm. They
You're-
had the nurse cells.
You're on the right track. This primary oocyte is going to suddenly complete meiosis 1 and enter into meiosis 2. It's going to become a secondary oocyte. And now it's completely different genetic material. And so we want to have a blood-brain barrier to protect it. Not blood-brain, blood oocyte barrier,
Yeah.
not blood-brain. Well, there's, you know. Yeah. So, meiotic events. We've got all of this happening at the same time. We've got our primary oocytes are housed in primordial follicles. They are still diploid. They have not completed meiosis 1 yet. In fact, this is all happening before you're even born. Turning into primary oocytes, right? All the oogonia get converted to primary oocytes. Everything is in arrest. Primary follicles, primordial follicles, all of that is just in arrest. Nothing's happening with the ovaries until puberty. We hit puberty. What happens during puberty? Now we have gonadotropin releasing hormones, stimulating the pituitary to release follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone stimulating the ovaries to develop follicles. The follicles start to produce estrogen and progesterone. Puberty on to menopause. We go from these primary oocytes, housed in primordial follicles, then primary follicles, then secondary follicles, and then mature follicles. And that mature follicle, remember, we go from primary oocyte to a secondary oocyte. So this is going to become a secondary oocyte. It's completed meiosis 1, now it's in meiosis 2. In meiosis 1, remember, we got sister chromatids. Sister chromatids from mom, chromosome 1, from pop, chromosome 1, snuggle up, cross over. They do all the same things during meiosis 1, and then metaphase plate, anaphase meiosis 1, telophase meiosis 1, secondary oocyte, polar body, right? And then that secondary oocyte is in meiosis 2, arrested until it's completely fertilized. That secondary oocyte is ovulated. What happens during ovulation? It's popped off of the ovary and it produces this structure called a corpus luteum. We'll talk about that in a moment. That secondary oocyte then is available for fertilization. If the sperm fertilizes it, makes its way inside, it's going to stimulate this secondary oocyte to complete meiosis 2, make another polar body, boom, we got an ovum. And that ovum becomes a zygote. Now this one is saying that these polar bodies are going to continue to divide. There's nothing clear about whether or not that actually happens. So we don't know if there's 4 polar bodies produced or 2 polar bodies produced, and we're not going to worry about that. We're going to just know that polar bodies, at least 2 of them are produced, and their whole job is to get rid of that extra chromosomal material. So for meiosis 1, we take the extra sisters, and we're left with one secondary oocyte with one set of sisters, 23 sisters. You know what I mean by a sister, right? Duplicated chromosomes. And then meiosis 2 is to separate those sisters. And we end up with one new, completely different genetic material set of chromosomes in the ovum. Sperm has its own set of unique DNA material of single chromatin. Mix that up, boom, you got a whole new individual. But you can see where all those family resemblances come from, right? That little crossing over and your aunt and your uncle and your father's brother, and then you got your husband's stuff and your, yeah, pretty cool, pretty amazing. All right, so the ovarian cycle, we've been talking about it. We have a 28-day, not necessarily the same for everybody, but 28 days is your standard ovarian and menstrual cycle, 28 days. You got a follicular phase, as it says. What's the follicular phase? That's where the follicle is developing. You have the ovulation, oocyte popped off of the ovary, and then you have the luteal phase. And the luteal phase is where that oocyte is floating down the oviduct, but the ovary is left behind, and the ovary has produced a structure called a corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is going to become known as a temporary endocrine structure because it's going to carry on the production of estrogen and progesterone that this follicle is not able to do anymore because it's going to actually, essentially, become a scar eventually. In fact, this becomes that. All right, everybody following me still? Okay, so the follicular phase, uterine, menstrual, and proliferative phases. Yes, this is where menstruation begins. So we begin our cycle with the first day of menstruation, not the end, which I always used to think was the beginning of, because that's when I always felt better, right? You feel better anyway because all that pressure's gone, yeah. Yep. So the beginning of our follicular phase is the beginning of menstruation, the first day of menstruation, day 1. And it goes from day 1 to day 14. And then day 15, typically, or day 14, ovulation. And the second half of the cycle is where the corpus luteum is producing estrogen and progesterone. And that oocyte, that secondary oocyte, is traveling down the oviduct waiting to be fertilized. And if it doesn't get fertilized, then eventually the lining of the uterus sheds because there's no need for it. There's no hormones producing to keep it in place, and away it goes. And you're on to the next month. Yeah, this is interesting. In response to estradiol, what's estradiol? Estrogen. A dominant follicle, right, this guy, is going to upregulate follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone receptors. What does that mean? What does upregulate mean?
Create more of it.
Yeah, make more receptors. So it's even more responsive to those hormones. Yeah. The antrum's developing, right? We got our antrum developing here, and then we're going to get more and more follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone receptors, and that's the one that's had all the attention showered on it, including that extra follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone ultimately. And as we get higher levels of estrogen produced by this follicle, then we're going to see a negative feedback. So the negative feedback is going to tell the pituitary, hey, you can chill the follicle-stimulating hormone. We don't need that for the moment because we've already got a follicle that's already going. It's on its way. So don't need the FSH at the moment. Wait till the next cycle. And this is what that's all about. So we have our gonadotropin-releasing hormone that is going to release and stimulate the production of FSH and LH in the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is going to deliver that FSH and LH, especially the LH at this point, to cause ovulation. And that mature follicle secreting estradiol means that we don't need as much of this, we don't need as much of that because we've already got plenty going on in the follicle itself. So a little negative feedback going on back there. First phase is follicular, second phase is ovulation. That ovulation is going to result in the production of something called the corpus luteum. And this is what's known as the luteal phase. Luteum, get it? Corpus luteum. And this corpus luteum is going to release more hormones, progesterone and estrogen, especially important because the estrogen and progesterone stimulate the uterus to maintain the uterine lining. And that uterine lining happens on a monthly basis, right? We build up the uterine lining and then it sheds. We build it up and then it sheds. But if we have an embryo, it's been fertilized, it makes its way to the uterus, it's going to then find a nice little snuggle spot and burrow itself into the wall of the uterus. Literally burrows itself into the wall of the uterus. And the lining is there to support that embryo until the placenta can get involved. And we have to build a placenta. And the placenta takes about 12 weeks to build. Once the placenta is in place, then the corpus luteum can go bye-bye. It becomes a corpus albicans, a little scar tissue. And the uterine lining is there, it's still supporting the developing embryo until that placenta completely takes over. And by that time, it's all sort of pressed up against the walls because now we have an embryonic sac and, the whole structure that's containing the fetus. Yep. Yeah, so if fertilization doesn't happen, then okay, the corpus luteum just disintegrates, become known as a corpus albicans, and away we go for another year, or for another month, another year. So here's,
Wish.
yeah, right. Well, you could take a yeah. So we have our primordial follicles. Remember, they're all along the periphery, along the cortex. And then those primordial follicles lead to the development. Here's our little egg nest right here, primordial follicles. They lead to the development of some primary follicles. The primary follicles may get selected. One gets selected. Remember the upregulation of follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone receptors. This second primary follicle develops into a secondary follicle. You can see the antrum is starting to show up here. And then that secondary follicle develops a bigger and bigger antrum, and ultimately this fluid-filled pocket is going to punch out an oocyte, a secondary oocyte, leaving behind a pit called the corpus luteum. Corpus luteum becomes corpus albicans if it's not used. If it's needed, it's going to be our producer, our estrogen progesterone producer, until the placenta gets in place to support that developing embryo and fetus. And so, this brings us to an important message